Hello, I'm going to show you how to create a shirt collar. So to do that you're going to need to cut out quite a few pieces to create the sample. So the first bit you're going to cut out is the shirt front. There's going to be 2 of those. Then you'll need to cut the shirt back, and you'll cut one of these on the fold, and then you'll need to cut the neckband, and you'll cut 2 of these in fabric plus 1 in interfacing, and then you'll cut the collar, and there'll be 2 of those in fabric and 1 in interfacing. So both these 2 pieces, the neckband and the shirt collar, are cut on the fold, and also the back piece is cut on the fold, and you'll see that that's got that arrow here to show you, and it also says. So once you've cut all your pieces, you'll then need to transfer the markings that are shown on here. So you'll need to cut any notches that are there denoted by the snips, and you'll also need to cut some small snips, as it says here, for where you've got the fold lines on the front. So I'm going to work my way around the patterns and just do those to begin with. So I'm going to put a small snip here, here and here. So I've marked the centre front and the 2 fold lines, and then I do that at the top. And then further round on the shoulder I'm going to cut the notch there to match later. So that's that piece done. On the shirt back I'm going to cut a snip here in the neckline, and then I'm going to cut another snip here to mark the notch on the shoulder. And on the collar piece there are 2 notches here, and on the neckband I'm going to put a snip to mark where the centre front is, here and here, and I'm also going to put a snip here and here, which will match up with the snips on the collar that I've just done. So, oh, nearly missed one, and there's one there. So I've cut my interfacing as well, and when I've cut the interfacing for the neckband and for the collar pieces, I've cut those so that they're just slightly smaller than the pieces that I'm going to apply them to. So I just need 1 for the neckband cut on the fold, and 1 for the collar cut on the fold. To add a little bit of structure to the front of my garment, I'm actually going to put in some interfacing to go into the section that will be folded. So I've just cut a small piece here which is slightly wider than where the fold line is here, and slightly shorter than the edges. So that will just sit on that section and cover that fold line, and that just makes sure that that's sturdy, as if I was going to put some buttonholes on there. So I've cut 2, so I've got 1 for each side of the front piece. The next thing I need to do is to take the pins off, take the pattern piece away, and then I'm going to stay stitch around the neckline here, stay stitching around this edge, and then doing the same on this side, and I'm going to do the same on the back piece, so I can take the pins out of the back piece, and then I can open that up and stay stitch around the neck edge on here. So the stay stitching is going to stop this edge from stretching as I start to construct the garment, and it's also going to allow me to cut snips up to the stay stitching to allow this to spread to match to the collar. So it's quite important that you do put this in. When you do the stay stitching, you'll be sewing about 1.3 centimetres from the edge of the fabric, so it's in the seam allowance but very close to where you're going to stitch along the seam line. Before I put the stay stitching around the neckline, I'm going to apply the interfacing to the front sections of the garment. So I've got my 2 pieces of interfacing. This is the shiny side, or the bit with the glue on. That's going onto the wrong side of the fabric, and then I'm going to cover it with some cotton before I put the iron on. Okay, so that's stuck, and now I'm ready for my stay stitching. The stay stitching that I'm going to do is going to go around the neckline, and it will be about 1.3 centimetres from the edge, and I just use a regular length stitch. I'm going to do that on each piece. So that's the back done and both the fronts done. So the next stage is to fold along the snip line. So I'm going to match the snips there and there, press a fold in that, and then fold it over again along the other snip lines. So I'll be folding a small amount of the interfacing into the fold along the second line. And then I'll do the same on the second side. So folding along the snips. And then folding again on the next snips. I'm just going to long machine stitch across the top and the bottom to hold those in place for the moment. So I've changed my stitch length to the longest stitch length, and I'm going to just put some stitching across the top there. And then across the bottom. So I'm stitching within the seam allowance about 6mm or so from the bottom. And I'm going to do the same, so you can see the stitching top and bottom. I'm going to do the same with the other piece. And this just holds the folds secured for the moment. Okay, if I was making an actual garment, I would possibly top stitch from the right side, either side of this section, so that the folds are held permanently in place, or I might just leave it, and then once I've sewn the buttons and the buttonholes onto either side of the front, they will hold the folds in place without the need for the top stitching. So it just depends on your personal preference when you're making something. So next I'm going to take my front and back, and I'm going to sew them together along the shoulder seams, matching the notches. So I've pinned my pieces right sides together, so that's the front opening. Front to the back, I've pinned them across the shoulder seams on both sides, and I'm going to sew that seam. So make sure you've changed your stitch length back to a regular stitch, and I'm going to sew 1.5 centimetres from the raw edge along the shoulders. So you can stitch over your pins, or you can take them out as you come to them. Because my fabric is quite thin, I find it's easier to take the pins out, or else it might distort about that point. And then I'll stitch the second shoulder. So that's both the shoulder seams done. So next is to just trim the edges with the pinking shears, and I really do just trim the very edges, so you'll see I'm barely cutting anything away, and then I'll press these seams flat. So I'm back to the ironing board, and I want to open up the seams that I've just made and press those flat. So it's important that you do the pressing at each stage. Don't miss it out, because it is much easier if these seams are pressed. So while I'm at the ironing board, I'm going to apply the interfacing to the neckband and to the collar pieces. So I'll start with the collar piece, and I can take the pins off the fabric. I've got 2 collar pieces, but I just need to apply interfacing to one of them. So my interfacing is about a medium weight, and it's ever so slightly smaller, and I'm also going to just cut the corners off so that when I sew the seams I don't have the bulk of the interfacing in the seam at the corner as well, and that will allow them to be a bit more pointed and sit flat. So just make sure that that is shiny side down. I'll put my cotton over there. Okay, so that's applied, and then what I need to do is to apply the interfacing to one piece of the neckband. So again, I can take all the pins off now. And on the neckband I've also got 2 pieces, but I only need to apply interfacing to one of them. And again, the interfacing is cut ever so slightly smaller. So again, you might find you need to press your fabric first if it's not flat. Make sure you do that before you apply the interfacing. So interfacing applied to one piece of the neckband, interfacing applied to one piece of the collar. For the next stage, I need my interfaced neckband and my garment piece, and I need to pin this neckband around the neck edge. I've got notches here, and those are the 2 notches that are going to match to the notches on the back neck section. So I can start at that point because I know that's where they will meet, and I can pin those pieces together there. So matching the notches in the centre back of the neck edge with those on the neckband. And then I know that I want this edge to overhang by 1.5 centimetres, just there. So that overhangs the front edge by 1.5 centimetres, and this is going to overhang the other front edge by 1.5 centimetres. You'll also have a little snip here that you snipped earlier, and that marks the centre front, and you'll have a small snip marked in your front section of the garment to mark the centre front. So you'll find that those notches should meet, and that will give you the 1.5 centimetres of overhang at this front edge. So I could put another pin across the fold section of the front, and I'll just do that on the same on this edge. Now this bit can be quite difficult to try and match, and actually it's much easier if I pin and stitch from the wrong side. And what I'm going to do is put some clips in to help me match that raw edge, and match those raw edges together. Now depending on the type of fabric you've got, you might need more clips. So mine's quite a flimsy fabric so it actually is a bit more pliable to get that to match. But just to make sure I'm doing it evenly, I've just put a few snips. I don't want to stretch the fabric, so I just put a few snips up to the stay stitching that I did earlier. Quite often on a neckline, on a collar pattern where you've got a neckband, you'll have something which will be a marker on the neckband to match to the shoulder seams. On my pattern I haven't got those. So I'm going to just pin that in place so my raw edges meet. And I want to pin across the seam allowance there so that the seam allowance will sit flat when I sew it, and then I can just pin these other raw edges together. So I'm going to carry on pinning all the way along in this way, cutting some snips so I'm not stretching the fabric but so that it will lie flat. Now I've pinned in place the neckband to the neck edge, I'm going to stitch that in place. I'm going to sew from the wrong side and I'm going to sew in 1.5 centimetres. Now that I've pinned the neckband to the neck edge, I'm going to start from the front edge and I'm going to stitch 1.5 centimetres in all the way along here, and I'm doing it from the wrong side so that I can make sure that this piece will sit flat as I stitch along. So my stitch line now should be slightly to the left of where I've stay stitched. So make sure you're not puckering the fabric as you stitch. And when you go across the seam allowance here, make sure the seam allowances are sitting flat. Okay, so that's the neckband on. Now I need to go back to the iron and press the seam allowance towards the neckband. So I can take the pins out. Now that's all stitched. And I need to trim down the seam allowance. This is going to reduce the bulk on the inside of the neckband section. What I also need to do around the curves is to just clip into them, and this will make it easier for this neck edge to sit flat. So I'm just putting small snips up to but not through the stitch line, just to alleviate a bit of the fullness around the curves. So it's more important where it is most curved. and then I can press without creasing the fabric, and that should press quite well because you've alleviated the stress there on those curves. So give that a good press all the way round. Try not to crease the fabric. If you do, just give it another quick press. And then just check from the right side that that is well pressed. If you've got any sections where it isn't, just give it another quick press from the right side. For the next stage, I need to come back to the collar and take my interfaced piece and my non-interfaced piece and place them right sides together. And I'm going to pin them in place around the outside edge. Now I want to make sure that when I stitch across the points that I get it exactly in the right place. So what you might want to do here is to just mark where that stitch line is, so that you make sure that your both sides of the collar are going to be even. So I just measure in 1.5 centimeters. And this is a pen that's going to disappear in time, so it will come out, or it should come out. So I can pin these edges together. So I've now pinned my collar piece together going along the outer edge. This edge here is going to stay open, so I've not pinned that side. So starting from the top right edge, I'm going to just stitch all the way around the edge here, pivoting when I get to the point there. So I'm stitching 1.5 centimeters in. You might find it easier if you use the hand wheel when you get close to that corner, and then pivot when you're at the point. Not quite there. You can always make the stitch length ever so slightly smaller as well, so you just take a very tiny stitch to go a little bit further, and then turn back to a regular stitch and carry on. So making the stitch length ever so slightly smaller, take another stitch along, and then when I pivot I can see there that I'm not quite on that 1.5 centimeters line, so I'm going to take another tiny stitch and just try that again, and that's much better. Now I've stitched all the way around the edge of the collar, I need to trim away some of the seam allowance. I'm going to trim quite a bit away actually. I'm leaving about 3 millimeters on each of the edges. At the corner I'm going to cut close to, but not cutting too close to the corner because I don't want to end up causing a hole there. And then I need to turn the collar to the right side. Now at the corners, what I will do is fold that edge in and fold that edge in, and then put my hand inside and then try and turn that through. And then in a minute I'm just going to get my point turner and turn that a bit more closely. So on this edge I'll do the same thing, so folding along the stitch line and then holding that point there, putting my hand inside the collar and then trying to fold that, turn that to the inside with that point folded. So I can get my point turner and I can just poke that into the corner. This is much better than using scissors because you've got a sharp point on scissors and they can just go all the way through. So it's almost pointed, and then on the other edge I can do the same, so using the point turner. You can just buy these on eBay or Amazon or at any of your local fabric and haberdashery shops. So it's not a particularly specialist tool, they do sell them everywhere. Okay, so that's done. Another trick you can use for pulling out corners is to take a pin and to just try and ease out the fabric at the corner, although you do run the risk of pulling out too much. So I try and sort of grab hold of a thread if I can and pull on one of the threads rather than pulling on the actual fabric. So you can see the stitches there. So pretty happy with that corner, and then what I need to do is to press it flat all the way round. And while I do that, either before I do that, what I want to do is to just get the iron inside the collar, I'll do it the other way, and press the seam allowance. So I've got my interfacing side this side and I've got the non-interface side towards the iron, and I'm pressing the interface, the seam allowance towards the interfaced piece. You can only get the iron in so far while you're doing that. So just go as far as you can. And then what that does is it allows you to fold this back. So that should sit along the edge of the seam perfectly. So you don't want a bit more folded over, or you don't want to end up where you've got a slight pleat here, so that should be right on the edge. And I find that pressing to one side first just makes the process a bit easier, and you can rub it in your fingers to get it right on the edge, and then press again, pressing that flat. So I'm going to do that all the way round, and then the collar is going to be applied to the neckband. Now I've pressed the collar flat all the way round, I'm going to just run a long machine stitch across this open edge to hold those two raw edges together. I'm just going to put that about 1 centimetre in from the raw edge. I've turned my stitch length up to the longest stitch length, and I've just put a few pins along the edge to keep the edges together, because this fabric's quite flimsy and has a tendency to move. So I'm starting 1 centimetre in from the raw edge. Okay, so that's done. So I've got my collar piece which I've finished, and the raw edges are tacked together, and then I'm going to apply that to the neckband of this. I'm going to put a snip to mark where the centre is, and I'm going to do the same on the collar. You should also have, if you mark them from your pattern, you've got a double notch there and a double notch there, so you'll have those markings too on your fabric. So now I've got the centre snip there, I can match to the centre snip. The interface side of the collar, which you should be able to work out which one that is, the interface side is underneath, and that's the one that's going right side together with the neckband. So I'm going to match where I've got my centre snip there, and then this point should meet where the snip is there for the centre front, so I can match the edge there with the snip there and pin, and then that should meet that edge, and where I've got my notches there, those notches should meet there. I only cut those quite small, so you won't probably be able to see them, and then those edges should meet nicely, so you don't need to ease these two together in any way. They should really match up exactly. And then I can make sure that these match at the same point. So again, I've got a snip here that marked the centre front, and that's where the collar will sit here. And again, the notches there match up. The notches on the collar match with the notches on the neckband. And the rest of that piece should come together and meet up. So I can just put some pins along that edge. And then I'm going to sew these two together in a moment with a long machine stitch again, and I'm just going to sew along the line that's already there. And then the final piece, while I'm at the ironing board, I'm just going to press my other neckband piece, and I'm going to press along this edge here. So this edge has got the notches in, you can see the small snips here. So I'm on the unnotched edge, I'm going to turn this up by 1.5 centimeters, so you can measure that to make sure it's accurate. And I'm just going to press that into place. Okay, so 1.5 centimeters turned up on the unnotched edge. So I've still got my machine set to the longest stitch, and I'm going to just stitch along the line that I've already made here. So that's stitching about 1 centimetre from the raw edge. Now that the collar is attached to the neckband, the next stage is to take the remaining neckband piece, and that will match to the other one. Where I've got the folded edges there, they should meet. The notches along the top edge should meet, and I've got the centre marked there. I'm going to just mark the centre of the neckband piece as well to make it a bit easier. So I've got another marker there. So I just put a pin here. So that's where that's going to meet, in the middle there. So I can match the raw edges together. And then put some pins all the way round. So you'll see the two folded edges here match, and both edges are folded up. So that's where I've trimmed my seam allowance here, and that's folded up on that edge. And I can pin that in place, and then just put some pins in, matching the notches, matching the centre front snips. So on this edge here, I'm going to just mark in where that stitch line would be. and then do the same on the other curve. And then I'm going to stitch that all the way along that edge. So I've changed now back to a regular length stitch, and I'm going to start from this folded edge here, and I'm going to make sure that my stitch line begins here flush with this front folded edge. So I want to start exactly from that point. So even if that's not 1.5 centimetres in, I will start at that point. Now I've marked where I want to go around the curve, so I'm going to follow that line around the curve. You might find that if you change your stitch length to a shorter stitch, you could get a neater and more curved curve by doing that. The only trouble is if you go wrong and need to unpick it, it's quite hard to unpick a very small stitch. So I'm kind of moving and pivoting around that corner, and then I'm going to stitch across the top here, following the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So again, now I'm back to the other curved edge. I can just go around that, following the line that I've made. You can use the hand wheel if you find that's easier and really take your time. And then I finish again stitching flush with this folded front edge. So you can see my stitch line is in line here. So the neckband is now sewn on, and I've sandwiched the collar in between the two neckbands. So what's left to do is to trim away about half all the way round of that seam allowance. If you've got quite a lot of bulk here, you could layer the seam. So it depends on the thickness of the fabrics that you're working with. And then I'm going to put some clips around the curves. And then just put a few more along this edge. And then this neck edge will fold back, this neck band will fold back, sorry, and the collar will come out there. And this can be pressed to give yourself a nice curved edge here, and pressed over this way all the way along, and the folded edge should just cover the stitches there. So I'm going to give this a really good press. So what I'm going to do next is to make sure that all this seam allowance is pressed into the neckband, and then the folded edge there will come over this edge so that this fold just covers the stitch line. I can put some pins in all the way along, and then I'm going to hand stitch that in place. To slip stitch this finished, I've just taken a needle and thread and I've tied a knot into one end. I'm going to leave the knot inside this edge here. And then I'm going to work my way along the folded edge of my neckband. I'm going to go through the fold of the neckband, and then into the centre front, then back along the neckband. Then I'm going to pick up a stitch there in the front and then back into the neckband. My stitches in the neckband along that fold are about 0.5 centimetre to 1 centimetre long, and then I'm just using the stitches from the previous line here where I stitched to secure to. I'll try and tuck those bits of thread in. And then I pull on that there, so I should be able to get myself quite an invisible finish as I go along. So through the fold and pick up a stitch, back through the fold, pick up a stitch, and I'm just going to do that all the way along. So now I've got onto the main part here, along the fold, pick up that stitch there. So I'm using the stitch, not the threads of the fabric, then back into the fold of the neckband, and then picking up a stitch from that last line of stitching, back into the fold again. So it's quite a slow process, but I'm going to work my way all the way along, and as you'll see, it gives you an invisible finish along here. So I've nearly made it all the way back round again. I've just got the final little bit to do, and as I stitch across here, I'm making really tiny stitches into the front section here, so that's got interfacing, so it's not going through to the right side at all, but I can get a bit more of an anchor by stitching through the fabric rather than just through the stitches as I was doing before. So a small stitch across the front and then a small stitch through the fold. And you'll see it creates this sort of like ladder effect with the stitches, but then when you pull on that thread, it creates a pretty much invisible finish. So that's how it should look all the way along that edge. So I'll just get to the end here and finish off. Just make a few stitches there to secure the threads. Do take your time with this, don't try and rush it and just make large stitches, because it won't hold together very well and it won't look very good. So you can see that's how it looks from the right side, from the wrong side. I'm just going to stitch in the ditch there in that seam just to finish off and make sure that's secure. and then I can cut my thread. Now the neckband's attached, if you want to, you can top stitch all the way around the neckband piece. So if you're going to do that, you would be stitching, say, about that far, so probably about 2mm in from the seam line, and the same at the bottom, and you'd go all the way around and around this edge when you do that. I'm not going to bother on my sample, I'm quite happy how it is, so I've just gone around the remaining edges and just pinked them with the pinking shears. So give that one final press and that's your sample complete.